This video is the first part of a series where I examine important aspects of Christianity to see if they are true. I will start out by talking about hell, specifically near-death experiences that involve a literal hell. The term near-death experience is commonly shortened to NDE for convenience. So if someone has a heart attack, for example, and they leave their body and find themselves in a place that they identify as hell, or that they find themselves being judged unworthy by God, that is the sort of thing that most people would argue highly suggests that Christianity is correct about the afterlife in those respects. There are two near-death experiences that I want to highlight. The first is an atheistic university professor who experienced being maliciously pinched and then torn apart by malevolent beings. The second is a woman who attempted suicide, who experienced the slide down into a cold, dark, and watery place. She heard cries, wails, moans, and gnashing of teeth. She saw human-like beings, but they were ugly, grotesque, and sounded like they were being tormented. Tenets of Christianity are that life is sacred and that suicide is wrong. The Bible talks about how God is the only way to salvation. So an atheist and a suicidal woman are not likely to see heaven, rather they are likely to see hell in the afterlife according to mainstream Christianity. So the first strong argument in favor of Christianity is that specific beliefs about punishment in a hellish place are observed to be true by some people at least in near-death experiences. Naturally, the first strongest argument against Christianity would be a rebuttal to the biblical punishment perspective. Those two mentions of hellish near-death experiences mentioned before were from a scientific paper written by Dr. Bruce Grayson and Nancy Evans Bush. Dr. Bruce Grayson has mentioned that he has known people who were on death row in prison that had positive and beautiful near-death experiences. In comparison, there were people who lived saintly lives and had seen terrible things in their near-death experiences. Furthermore, people can start off with a very frightening near-death experience that they are resisting, and then realize once they stop resisting it, it becomes very blissful and enjoyable. So it is definitely not the case that only bad people have bad near-death experiences and only good people have good ones. Very few people who have had near-death experiences see the typical hellish things like fire, brimstone, and demons. Hellish NDEs that have such details tend to happen to people who are raised in religions that believe in hell, for example, Roman Catholics and Southern Baptists. Since I definitely believe in life after death due to the clear evidence, I don't doubt in the least that these people actually did experience a hell of some kind. So the obvious question is, why are some people going to these hellish places? If Christians who were raised in a specific environment that had a significant influence on their beliefs, and they tend to see a literal hell in the afterlife, it doesn't require a lot of thought to determine that there is some sort of cause and effect going on here. However, being raised in a hellfire and brimstone belief system does not always result in hellish near-death experiences, and people who weren't raised that way may also see a literal hell. Supporting evidence also comes from people who have intentionally caused out-of-body experiences that are commonly referred to as astral projections. The goal of astral projection is to intentionally separate your soul or consciousness from your body so that you can have experiences that are not normally possible. Of hundreds of subjects that tried astral projection, only 2 reported having a downward into hell experience. It appears that these 2 people had these experiences because they had the idea of the existence of hell strongly imprinted on them by their fundamentalist Christian parents. Jeffrey Long has studied and compiled a significant amount of near-death experiences. He says that many of the people who have had hellish experiences have the sense that all they ever had to do was sincerely desire to leave the hellish area and that they could do so after that. It appears that people who are in these hellish areas have chosen to be there. Also, when people observe these hellish areas, they're almost always separated away from the more pleasant and heaven-like realms. So if some people are in hellish areas in the afterlife and they have the option to leave, the evidence would suggest that the people involved either don't understand how the system works, or they are unwilling to change their nature or desires in a way that would save them from their decisions. Robert Monroe wrote about what he learned from his experiments in astral projection. It's inherently difficult to definitively prove what he witnessed did actually happen, which is like what near-death experiencers also encounter. All I can say is that he did give some instructions on how to have an out-of-body experience, so if you do not believe him, you could try it and see for yourself. It's difficult to adequately explain this, but he went to somewhere else that was not Earth. He called it Locale 2. For context, almost everyone who has had a near-death experience describes a very blissful afterlife. Locale 2 seems to include both blissful heavenly places and very unpleasant places. It may be helpful to think of Locale 2 as not just an afterlife, but more like an extremely large spiritual dimension. Robert mentioned that sometimes when he passed through our world to Locale 2, he would have to go through a gray-black ocean where the slightest motion attracts nibbling and tormented beings. These beings are subhuman and evidently have the ability to think and act independently. Certainly this place is a hell of some kind, and these creatures are malicious and could be easily described as demon-like. Yet it would be better to find a better name for such creatures, one that is more descriptive and that doesn't have so much religious baggage. Perhaps abyssal creatures is more appropriate. The important thing that I want to stress is where you travel to in Locale 2 seems to be determined by your deep constant motivations, emotions, and personality drives. So certain aspects of who you are and what you want determine where you go in Locale 2. This directly corresponds to what was previously mentioned about near-death experiences. So when your spirit is separated from your body due to death or due to astral projection, some of the same core rules still apply when you travel to a spiritual, non-earthly realm. So I'll just take it as a given that you do not want to be endlessly tormented by demonic creatures in the afterlife. While you can't go back in time and change what sort of belief system you were raised in, you can take the time now to acknowledge that the afterlife works in certain ways. If you let negative thoughts and behaviors control your life now, you will likely continue to let this happen in the afterlife and end up in a very unpleasant realm. Brian let negative thoughts and behaviors control his life, and because of it, he ended up in a black void during his near-death experience. This void or abyss consisted of darkness and noise that was sort of like static. He specifically said that he knew he was in hell, but he did not care. He also said that he did not know how to leave this void. His negative thoughts and his ignorance of how the afterlife works is what left him totally unprepared. At that time, he was just the sort of person that could spend a very long time in a very unpleasant place, completely unaware that if he had just had the determination to desire change, he could go somewhere better. It's important to note that not all people that go to the void have an unpleasant near-death experience. For some people, they have very positive, blissful feelings in this place. People like Brian that grow up in Western Christian countries may interpret a negative experience in the void as hell, while people who have been raised in the Hindu cultures may interpret it as nirvana. For those of you who do not know, nirvana in the Hindu belief system is the liberation from the cycle of reincarnation and is a transcendent positive state. Obviously, just because a place is unpleasant, that does not make it a literal biblical hell, and just because you are not immediately reincarnated after death, that does not mean you are in nirvana. I believe both of the previously mentioned interpretations of the void are not very accurate, because what they are is an imposition of cultural interpretations onto something that transcends cultures. It is better to describe realms or places in the afterlife solely by their characteristics, and be aware of how our cultural biases tend to cloud our understanding of the world. Another book about astral projection talks about how if you can create your own reality while disembodied, then it is conceivable that fears of demons or unfriendly creatures can create encounters with such creatures. So such creatures may appear to be demons, but they are not true demons. It's basically impossible to determine whether an unfriendly being or demon-like creature would exist if you were not there. Regardless if it's a true demon or a figment of your imagination, you are certainly not powerless during astral projection. Whether you encounter a malevolent creature in astral projection or in the afterlife, you need to remember that your thoughts and intentions hold power. The first step of exercising power is acknowledging that you have it, and the second step is rejecting fear. Finally, I can't definitively say why Christians tend to be the ones who end up in hell, but my theory is that when you are raised in a certain religious environment, hell becomes a very tangible and certain place. When you combine that with the elements of fear, shame, and guilt, these negative thoughts may continue with the rest of your consciousness into the afterlife.